Recently, I had the chance to interview someone who is a true trailblazer in the community named Maeley. Maeley has had such an influence on presidential, gubernatorial, and local political campaigns that it's earned her the nickname of the political godmother of the API community. It's my true pleasure to introduce her to you. She served in the two highest staff positions of both houses of the California legislature, namely the Chief Administrative Officer of the Assembly and subsequently Chief of Staff to the Senate President Pro Tem. She broke the bamboo ceiling in the state capitol at a time when APAs were struggling to find their voice. She organized historic statewide and national events that united the APA voice by forcing gubernatorial or presidential candidates to address APA issues in a public forum. Maeley may be retired now, but she remains active in mentoring young API professionals seeking elective office at the local, state, and national levels, as well as API professionals seeking executive careers in the private and public sectors. Maeley has worked behind the scenes to mentor so many public leaders who have served or are serving now in political office, including Betty Yee, Mark Takano, John Chung, and Mona Pasquill. Please enjoy. Well, good afternoon, Maeley. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon.
Absolutely.
And for those who, I've known you for 2 years now, and you helped us found California APAHM. But for those who may not personally know you, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. I guess my background is in politics, and I'm known mostly for my career in politics. I come from a very non-traditional family background in that I was not raised by my parents. My parents were in show business. They were in the Cantonese opera, and it was very customary for entertainers to send their kids out to foster care to be taken care by foster care home. And so I grew up actually under the culture and background of a French Basque woman who was my caretaker from the time I was 2 weeks to 8 years old. And then my mother decided that it was time for me to learn Chinese. So she took me out of the foster care home and put me with some Chinese families so I would learn Chinese. I lived with my mother for a couple of years, but I was pretty much on my own since the time I was 14. I graduated from high school at the age of 16, put myself through college, cleaning houses and shelving library books. I wasn't very good in cleaning houses, but did well in library. And supported myself through college at San Francisco State, earned a degree in sociology and psychology. I wanted to become a social worker. But I was too young at that time, so I worked in the library until I went into the field of personnel administration at San Francisco State in that Sac State, and had a career in personnel for a short time, moved to Hawaii and worked myself up to become personnel director at the Honolulu International Airport. Moved to Sacramento to marry a Sacramento boy, had my first child, my only child, and lived next door to a lobbyist. And when I was ready to go back to work, the lobbyist told me that the majority whip had a position available and would like an Asian professional because he represented Monterey Park. I never stepped into the state capitol until my interview with the majority whip at that time of state capitol, and that was in 1974. I was really lucky to have been able to start my career in politics in a professional level. And I started as a legislative assistant to the majority whip. Found out that in the 70s, there were very, very little visibility of Asian Americans in the Capitol. In fact, there were only about 4 or 5 during that time. There were 2 legislators, that's Senator Al Song and Assemblywoman March Fong Yu, who were pioneers who broke the glass ceiling as being the first 2 legislators in California. But there just was a certain invisibility in the Capitol. So it just so happened that I met an Asian woman who was a Capitol veteran, Georgette Imura, and while she was working with her boss, who was an African American legislator, and I was working with my boss, who was Latino, we were very busy working with public policy issues affecting blacks and browns. And we said to ourselves, but no one talks about Asians, and we're Asians. So this was in 76. So we said we should do something about it. What we did then is that we decided to gather the small number of Asian professionals in the Capitol, and we developed the Asian Legislative Staff Caucus. And we decided that the caucus could serve a purpose as a volunteer group going out to the community and educating the Asian Pacific Islanders, nonprofits, and different organizations about the value of engaging in the political process. At that time, Asians were very invisible because, one, they were a very small voter base. It was between 3 to 5%. They were split between 2 parties evenly, Democrats and Asians. Democrats and Republicans. And they never made waves. So as far as the Capitol was concerned, why bother? And that's what we wanted to challenge in getting more Asians to come to the Capitol, to run for office, recruit more Asian staff. And the information that we gathered during our workshops that we volunteered to do around the state was that we were able to come back and talk to the legislators and to inform them what issues were surfacing with their small Asian voter base. And as a result of that information exchange, we raised the profile of Asian voters at the Capitol. We also decided that to really make an impact and help Asians become successful candidates in the electoral process, you had to be involved with the state party system. So we asked our bosses to make us delegates, went to the State Democratic Party in 1980, and that was one of the first years where they created the Asian Pacific Democratic Caucus. And so what we did was we went to learn more about it. Next thing that happened was that I was elected chair, my buddy Georgette Imura was elected vice chair, and now we had a statewide network of different Asian Democratic clubs around the state who represented subethnic groups. Because as you know, it was very difficult to unite Asian Pacifics because there's a difference in language and culture, and the different subethnic groups pretty much stayed within themselves, trying to empower themselves. So what we said was, since we have access to a statewide network of Asian Pacific Democrats all around the state, why don't we do something with it? So we decided to organize the first Asian Pacific Democratic Leadership Conference. And what we did was we asked gubernatorial candidates to address Asian issues for the first time in the state of California. And
what year was that?
That was 1980. And the gubernatorial candidate was Tom Bradley. And so he addressed our conference, and it made quite a splash statewide that Asians were getting unified and wanted a voice and wanted some attention from the political establishment.
And how were you able to, kind of cross that threshold when the population of APIs in California still could not have been more than 4% at the time?
It was growing about that time. We started in 74 and 80. I think it was growing up to probably about 8%. But it was still small, and many didn't vote. So this was to create interest.
You mentioned that because your parents were in the opera, Cantonese opera, that you grew up from a very young age, I think you said 8 months, with a French Basque.
2 weeks, actually.
2 weeks.
To 8 years.
Yeah, 2 weeks to 8 years. So from 2 weeks to 8 years, you grew up with a French Basque family. Where was that, and if you can recall, what was that like?
Well, I grew up in the Richmond district in San Francisco, and then at that time it was very European oriented. Now, of course, it's the second Chinatown. I think what I gained from that, which helped me in politics and probably gives you a better understanding of who I am because of that background, is that the European culture, and especially French Basque culture, are very warm, very extrovert, very encouraging for their young children to express themselves, and they were very supportive of establishing standards of self-expression, having children, if they achieve, to talk about their achievements. They were a completely different culture than the Asian culture, Charles, where we're told not to talk about our achievements, not to, to blend more than stick out. Whereas the European culture is that you need to show your talent, you need to express yourself, and they're very warm and very compassionate, but also very encouraging for self-expression. And that made me a little different from Asians who grew up in the Asian culture. And it actually fit better in working in politics, because you need that type of a culture to kind of be able to express yourself and become more assertive and not be afraid of expressing your skills and talents. Where I feel that a lot of times in the Asian culture, it seems like you're bragging, and humility is so much more valued. So that upbringing did give me some attributes that helped me succeed in politics, and that's a very good question.
I believe you said that when you interviewed with the Senate Majority Whip, that was the first time that you had stepped foot in the Capitol. Wondering whether there were other experiences that you had before that time that kind of sparked or served as a foundation for your interest in politics, if at all.
Yeah, not really. And that is the surprising thing, that I was so apolitical until I applied for a job in the Capitol. And I think, like many Asians or like many individuals who don't get involved with politics, you just don't see it impacting your everyday life. And until I walked into the Capitol and started working there, did I realize that in this dome, in this building, decisions made impacted the lives of every Californian in every phase of their life. It was a real awakening.
And Maeley, over the span of your career, you started out in an entirely different profession.
I was in personnel.
You were in personnel and administration. You were a professional by the time you entered into the political realm.
Yes.
And then you jumped into it with 2 feet. That's the start, but what gave you the desire to stick with it for the period of time that you did?
I think I was totally enamored with the power that one had working in the legislature. And to see that I can influence policies that affect the everyday people. And I'll tell you a quick story. What really made me feel that politics was for me was that the first bill that I handled was the labeling of ground beef, the fat content in ground beef, because there was, the consumers were buying lean and regular and extra lean ground beef, but never knowing the fat content. So it was very easy just to put labels on without any boundaries of how much fat you're consuming, and it was kind of cheating the consumers. So my first bill was to mandate that lean had a certain amount of fat, extra lean had less fat, and regular had a certain amount of fat, so that it would inform the consumers when they buy their ground beef of exactly what the fat content. Now this is a very, not a big piece of legislation, but when Jerry Brown signed the bill and I went to the supermarket and I saw consumers picking up packages of lean beef and extra lean ground beef and actually knowing the fat content so that they were no longer being ripped off, I was hooked. I was hooked in politics because I said, I can make a difference.
Well, thinking back to that time when you worked on that bill from the start, shepherded it as it made its way through the process, through committees, through floor votes, and then finally having the governor sign it. Thinking back to that moment, what was that feeling like?
It was just like, here I am, this little person who came into the Capitol and worked this bill, and now when I go to the grocery store, I see the bill making impact. It was really what got me hooked into the Capitol and working there, because you find that you can make a difference.
I have to imagine that the transition from your first career in personnel to politics, that there must have been some bumps along the way and some growing pains. Are there any that stand out for you?
A lot, because you must imagine that in the 70s, when there were only like 3 or 4 Asian professionals actually working there in a very white male-dominated, powerful survival of the fittest environment, the first thing that I wondered was, how am I as a woman of color ever going to move up the ladder here? I mean, the way people would talk to you, they were condescending. Being in a professional position and an Asian woman, you had to really try to prove yourself, and that everybody assumed you were a clerical worker, or they challenged you, and they would say things like, "You speak English so well." I said, "Well, I'm an American," but things like that, comments like that, and so those were some initial barriers that I was confronted with. But moving up the ladder, because I was very fortunate to be able to ascend into the executive level of the state capitol, there were even more barriers to conquer there, because Asians in politics was already an anomaly. So having an Asian in a position with some authority was even that much more challenging.
I mean, talk about trailblazer, Maeley. You started in politics when there were maybe 3 or 4 others like you in politics in the Capitol, and then you ascend to the very top staff position in both houses. I'm not sure that has even today been replicated, but that it shows remarkable longevity. And I mean, you must have, what allowed you to do that? I mean, I have to imagine at a minimum it takes incredible grit and fortitude and toughness, but for those who might be starting out in politics, are there any kind of tips that you can share?
I think it's, first of all, I never saw myself as this extraordinary person or the smartest kid on the block, but I think luck and timing had a lot to do with it. It was because I had personnel background that there was an executive level position available, and it was called Deputy Administrative Officer of the Rules Committee. And the speaker then was Leo McCarthy, and he felt that it was time for us to recruit a more diverse professional staff that clearly reflected the demographics of California. And when this position came open, they were looking for ethnic minority who had personnel experience. And I just happened to be that person. And by the way, I didn't even go back to tell you, I was available for a job because when I worked for the Majority Whip, I worked for him for 2 years. And after 2 years, Art Agnos, who was Speaker Leo McCarthy's chief of staff, was elected. And all of a sudden, my boss got a phone call and said, "You're no longer Majority Whip," which meant that all of us who was on his staff, Majority Whip staff, we were out of a job. And that is one thing about working in politics. There's no civil service permanent rights, and you just really serve at the pleasure. But getting back to getting this position, it wasn't because I was so extraordinary again. It was just that I happened to be an ethnic woman with personnel background who was exactly what they needed for this fit. And that's how I entered into the executive level.
One of the things that I know is a passion of yours is mentoring young leaders, because I've heard about it and I've seen it firsthand. Just wondering what it is about that role and that service of mentoring that's been worthwhile for you and why you do it.
It's because that I think when I was growing up, I grew up without parents. I grew up without any real guidance from a stable type of parent-child relationship. So the people who helped me, Charles, were people who took me under their wings and mentored me as someone who could use the guidance. Because it played such an important role in helping me to succeed, it ingrained in me that it's, if those people had not helped me, I don't know where I would have landed up, but it was mentors through my life who helped me. And so I felt this almost this passion to give back to others who come for guidance and who come for help. And I also feel that success is really not success unless you can use your experience to help others succeed, or else it becomes a very selfish entity. And that's pretty much my philosophical bent on why I think mentoring is so important, especially with the Asian Pacific community too.
Yeah, I was mentioning to Ruthie that it wasn't until I became a parent, I have a 2-year-old toddler at home, that I realized just how human it is, this desire to teach something to someone who's younger.
Yes, and I think, when you feel so fortunate, and this other woman that I worked with in the capital, Georgia Imura, she felt the same way like I did. We're so lucky to be selected to work at the state capitol. How could we not want to share that access with our community who really needed to step up to empower themselves politically and to create a voice for themselves within the process that we were so lucky to be engaged in.
Maeley, you mentioned that one of the challenges you faced as you first tried to engage with community groups in the API community and elevate their voice and encourage people to run is the cultural division and diversity within the API community. What were some of the barriers you faced, and how were you able to transcend those?
That's a very good question, because it was not, I mentioned the first conference that we worked to unite the voices of Asian, in fact, they didn't say Asian Pacific Americans during those days. It was the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos. They didn't even use the term Asian Pacific Americans. But what we found was that the different ethnic groups were suspicious of one another. They were competitive. They wanted to create their own agenda. And there were still a lot of historical barriers between different cultures from the wars, where there was still ongoing resentments and hostilities. But how we adapted to a message to create some type of coalescing of these different sub-ethnic groups when we created the first conference that we put together in California was that we found some mutual issues that we said we should fight together, because when we're divided, we're so much weaker. And some of those messages, one message, quite frankly, that united everybody was the hate crime issue. Small business issues was a unifying issue. The redress issue was thought of primarily Japanese Americans, but a lot of the other Asian ethnic groups empathized with that. So that was a coalescing issue. We tried to just find common issues that would empower us. And when we went to each different sub-ethnic group, we told them, if you just want to lobby or advocate for just Korean issues, it's not going to carry as much weight as if you say, we represent all the Asian Americans here who have a problem with this issue. Because then your voter base is larger, and your community works as a united unity, so that a legislator can't say, well, a Korean has that, the Korean group has that problem, but you know, the Chinese vote for me, so I'm not too worried. You know, that's a Filipino problem. I don't have too many Filipinos in my district. So that it was kind of that divide and conquer mentality that didn't give us a strong voice in the legislature.
You know, you kind of look back through the Asian and Asian American presence in California, and stretches back to the 1800s. But really after the 1976 Act, or is it 1965 Act, we started to see an explosion and a rapid growth, particularly in California. But even today, we see different experiences from different waves of immigrants, and I can imagine the experience of mainland Chinese immigrants coming to the United States and to California today is quite different from those that immigrated here 40 or 50 years ago. And even though there might be the same ethnic identity, the experience is quite different. And I think we saw that last year in the API data disaggregation bill, where some of the most vocal opponents were recent Chinese immigrants. Wondering, looking forward, what you see as the best way for APIs to speak together as one voice and to stay as one group where the experiences might be so different.
It is, and I think the subject matter that really defines the differences that you're talking about is the affirmative action issue with universities. There's a clear divide among some of the newer immigrants who come from more affluent backgrounds, from China and other places, to American-born Asians who've lived through the civil rights and who understand that, we did not get to where we are today by fighting the battle of civil rights on our own. And I don't know if I have all the answers to that question, which is, I think, confronting us right now. I would only hope that organizations, such as the Asian Bar Association, can develop more of a cross-cultural type of relationships with the different culture and experienced Asian immigrants who are coming over here versus other groups. I think it really needs some much more cross-cultural types of interactions or organizations that can educate one another about the difference of values that we have because of the different experiences that we bring. And I think your organization, Asian Bar Association, is one that can do that.
I wonder, as someone who from 2 weeks old lived in a with a French Basque family, and it sounds like for most of your young life, really raised yourself.
Yes.
I think that's fair to say. I can imagine that, growing up in that environment, maybe you may not have felt, or maybe you did, a strong kinship to a Chinese American or an Asian American identity. But people have called you the godmother of Asian American politics. How did you go from here to there, and why was reaching out to the API community and elevating their voice, why was that important to you?
I didn't find my identity until my mother moved me to Chinatown to live with another strange family, and I went to Chinese school. I never lived in an environment where, I was in an environment where everybody looked like me. Although I have to say, the foster care home where I grew up in, she specialized in taking care of Chinese children.
Oh, really?
And she was so proud because she thought all her Chinese children were the smartest in the whole neighborhood. So she would always brag about us. So that kind of helped me with my self-esteem. But I think I have to say, I really didn't develop a consciousness of helping to empower my own community until I worked in the legislature, because I just saw how we were being left out. And I just felt that, again, if I was given that opportunity to be where I was in the seat of state power and my own community did not have a voice, that's what created this passion in me. I have to do something. We're lucky to be where we're at. And if we don't use our influence, because we were working every day with legislators who are the most powerful in the state of California, and if we didn't use our access to them to help our own community, then I think the value of us working there was minimal.
And when you first entered staff work in the Capitol, are there any examples that stand out for you of how the APA community's interests were ignored because APAs didn't have a voice back then?
Yes, we would have to monitor the budget items that our bosses were interested in, and we would see, for example, if there's healthcare resources, bilingual resources, education resources were being divvied up among other ethnic minorities, or when we saw legislation to protect civil rights of individuals, we just felt that Asians were never part of the discussion. And we saw how communities could be shortchanged too, because there was no voice to advocate for them. So a lot of the budget resources that impact health and welfare, immigration, education, were divvied up to the blacks and browns, and not very much to the Asian community. That's how it was a reality check to me, how we were missing out.
Gosh, I wish we had hours to do this, and I'm not sure you would have the patience for hours of this kind of conversation, but there's so much ground to cover. I wonder, Maeley, looking forward, what would you want the next generation of Asian American political leaders to achieve for the community in California?
I think that we've come a long way from the time that I was at the Capitol. And you could see that the Asian community is now the fastest growing ethnic minority community in the country. So our voter base is increasing. But we still lack the numbers to use those numbers of being the fastest growing ethnic community to translate them into votes. I don't know what it's going to take for us to galvanize our base to vote more. I mean, that's still a weakness for us. Secondly, we still have to break a lot of glass ceilings. We are among the most accomplished the most educated professionals in this country. And yet we still have so many glass ceilings to break, whether it be with Fortune 500 companies and serving on boards, whether it be serving in leadership capacities where we are actually what I call ahead at the table, not just at the table. And I'll give you an example. The reason why John Chung ran for governor, he had 4 safe years to stay as state treasurer. But he said, it's time that we demonstrate to California that while we can elect ourselves to state legislature, we also should be at the head of the table. We have that talent and capacity to serve either as governor of a state or to be speaker in Congress. Or we need to step up to show that we are as skilled as anybody else to become leaders. We still are handicapped with the stereotype that while we are so smart, we're so proficient, we're so talented, we're so skilled, but they don't quite see us as being skilled enough to be the top dog.
That's so interesting, and that mirrors the experience, not just in politics, but of APAs in really all professions.
Yes.
Including the law, where there's a threshold past which APAs tend not to rise. So you've identified voting, and then also not just being at the table, but being at the head of the table.
And asking to be at the head of the table. We are not as assertive or as aggressive to promote ourselves. And until we reach that capacity and to demonstrate that we want to be at the head of the table, we can be at the head of the table, and we have the skills and talents, if we don't ask for it, it's not going to happen.
And Maeley, you and I met each other approximately 2 years ago. Around that time in my personal life, I experienced something with my family that made me want to focus on doing more community work and making a positive difference. But for you in your personal life and in your work, I wonder if you'd be willing to answer the question, what makes for a meaningful life?
Oh, I definitely feel that what has helped me through my life, because I started with very little, and my philosophy was always, first of all, to look at the glass half full and not half empty. I didn't want to waste time feeling what I didn't have. I wanted to use my time to make the most of what I have. And I guess I live with the philosophy, and I read this quote, and it says that, happiness in life is not having the best of everything, but happiness in life is making the best of everything you have. And that has been kind of my motto.
I imagine that the viewers of this video might span many age ranges and age groups, but talking to my friends who've been watching some of these interviews, they tend to be younger professionals, maybe people starting out in their careers. Talking to this generation of young professionals who might be APA, is there any advice that you would like to share with them?
I would say in having gone through what I did through my career as an Asian woman, we've come to a place in society now that we don't have to let people define us. We don't have to always be defined as an Asian woman or as an Asian man. We have to define ourselves as just the best that we are, the best we can be, and not use the Asian title to define us. But and unless we believe that ourselves, we are just the best that we can be, we let others define us.
Thank you, Maeley.
Welcome.
Appreciate it.
Welcome.